Ancient Rome is remembered today as one of the greatest cities in history. It's a place where emperors lived in palaces, gladiators fought to the death, and where aqueducts brought clean water into the city. But while Rome may have been glorious in many ways, it was also filthy, disease-ridden, and stinky. And if you walked around the streets, you wouldn't just have to put up with the smell. You could have been attacked by bandits or even murdered for sport. So what did people actually do in ancient Rome? Let's find out. Rome was unbuilt in a day, and it took centuries for the city to grow to its full potential. In the earliest days of Rome, there weren't any indoor toilets or plumbing. And when you didn't have indoor plumbing, everyone had to share outdoor bathrooms. Unfortunately, these bathrooms weren't cleaned very often, and they were filled with all kinds of nasty things, from urine to feces to used menstrual pads. You might be asking yourself, why would anyone use these public bathrooms? Well, it's not because the Romans liked being dirty. The truth is, sanitation was important to the Romans, and they understood that keeping the city clean was key to stopping the spread of disease. There was just one problem. Though Rome was massive, and it simply was impossible for the city to have enough public bathrooms for everyone to use. This meant that many Romans used the streets themselves as their toilet. Instead of toilet paper, the Romans used a sponge on a stick. If you ever want to see a real Roman bathroom, you can visit the ruins of Pompeii, which has preserved some of these bathrooms in their filth. If you thought the last century was hot, you should ask someone who lived in ancient Rome. While Rome does experience chilly winters, summers can be extremely hot and the temperature climbs well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. With no air conditioning, people would do whatever they could to stay cool, like eating cold foods and sleeping outside at night. One thing people did to stay cool was cover themselves in oil or perfume. Unfortunately, this practice had an unintended consequence. Ancient Rome didn't have air conditioning, so the air would get stale very quickly. Public buildings were especially bad, and it didn't take long for them to smell like stale sweat. People would get headaches just from breathing the air indoors. Perfumes and incense were commonly used to try and cover up the stench. But unfortunately, these smells would just mingle and make the air even more disgusting. Of course, the average person couldn't afford fancy oils and perfumes, so they simply smelled bad. Some people tried to cover up their smell by throwing sand over their body, but this ended up making things worse because then the sand would stick to their sweat and dirt and just make them stink even more. For the rich, there was a solution. Prostitutes? Prostitutes would cover themselves in perfume and drape themselves over couches in taverns and bathhouses. This way, they could absorb the odors and keep the room smelling fresh. But for everyone else, there was no solution. Unless you're a fan of the smell of stale sweat, urine, and dirty bodies, you probably wouldn't enjoy spending much time inside in ancient Rome. Imagine you survived the summer heat and made it through the disgusting public bathrooms. Now you're walking down the street, happy to be alive, when suddenly you're attacked and robbed by a group of bandits. Welcome to ancient Rome. For most of human history, cities have been dangerous places, and ancient Rome was no different. Rome was surrounded by walls, but they were only meant to keep out invading armies. If you lived in ancient Rome, you would know that the area just outside the city walls was bandit country. These areas were called Villa Rustica, and they were full of criminals and other undesirable people. If you had to travel between Rome and the surrounding countryside, you'd need a guide to protect you from bandits. Even within the city, you needed to be careful. Thieves and pickpockets were everywhere. They would target wealthy merchants and tourists visiting the city. Oftentimes, fights would break out between locals and these outsiders. You didn't have to worry about petty crime in taverns and brothels, because those places were off-limits to outsiders. But in the streets, you were vulnerable. Murder was another problem in ancient Rome. And oftentimes these murders were committed by the most powerful people in the empire. Back in the days of the Roman Republic, it was common for wealthy aristocrats to hire killers to murder their enemies. It got so bad that Emperor Nero created a special police force to stop the killings. But even with the police force, murders were still common. Many of these murders were committed during chariot races. Chariot racing was an extremely popular spectator sport in ancient Rome, but the crowds could get out of control. If your favorite team lost a race, you might get so angry that you start throwing things. Before long, the whole crowd was throwing things, and the drivers and owners of the chariots would become targets. Chariot drivers were often slaves, and they were considered expendable. If a driver lost control of their chariot, they were sometimes thrown from the vehicle and left to die. Sometimes spectators would throw objects at the drivers, or even at each other. And if you happened to get hit by a stray rock, you might die. But perhaps the most frightening thing about watching a race in ancient Rome was the possibility of gang warfare. Gangs would fight in the stands and whole areas of the audience would become battlegrounds. If you accidentally sat in the wrong section, you could get caught in the crossfire. People were killed and entire families could be wiped out in a matter of minutes. Now let's say you decided to leave the dangerous streets and head home. You think you're finally safe, but you'd be wrong. Homes in ancient Rome could be dangerous too. Slaves and prostitutes were often given small rooms in other people's homes to live in. These rooms were usually dark, dank, and barely ventilated. Slaves and prostitutes had no rights in Roman society, and they were often abused by their landlords. And even if you weren't a slave or a prostitute, living in someone else's home could be risky. In ancient Rome, the main room in the house was shared by the family and their slaves. The slaves slept in this room at night, and if you wanted to get away from them, you'd have to lock yourself in your bedroom. Even in the dead of winter, this was a good idea. Roman slaves were known to rebel from time to time, and if they rebelled against your family, they might come looking for revenge. Most of the time, Roman slaves weren't dangerous, but they could pose a risk. If you sleepwalked, you might wander into the wrong room and attack one of the slaves or get attacked by one yourself. While slavery was common in many societies throughout history, Roman slavery was unique. Slaves weren't seen as human beings, and they had no rights whatsoever. A Roman slave could be bought, sold, or given away as a gift, and they could be treated however their owner wanted. In fact, some people became slaves for no reason at all. Free people could be kidnapped and sold into slavery, or they could be born into slavery even if their parents were free. It's hard to imagine how bad things were for slaves in Roman society, but luckily, we don't have to. Modern archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of skeletons that show signs of torture. Some of these skeletons belonged to slaves who were beaten to death, while others were tortured simply for the enjoyment of their captors. Life in ancient Rome was dangerous and disgusting, and if you were unfortunate enough to be born into slavery, you probably wouldn't live to see your 40s. But despite all the filth and disease, ancient Rome was also a center of culture, engineering, and the arts. And today, it remains one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. So what's your favorite fact about ancient Rome? And would you ever visit the city today? Let me know in the comments below. And thank you for watching.